Hello, I will speak a bit about cultivated plants, their domestication, and importance for the society. I thought it's quite nice to make this video on the background of harvested rice field. This is a valley north of Kyoto, Japan, and today is February 16th. So, cultivated plants, their importance for the society. If I start from that, I would tell first that very simple fact is that 70% of calories the average human being received originate from few cultivated plants, less than 20 species. So this is of course importance number one. We need a fuel, and that fuel comes out of cultivated plants. So if it's not important, nothing else is important. Of course, there are many other factors of importance, but this is number one. And then I would speak about domestication and cultivation. That's a huge topic, nicely illustrated in some way with this rice field. So, for example, cultivation and domestication process starts from the very simple idea: we need a plant which makes something useful in reliable quantities. Something useful is a very broad topic. It might be food, like rice. Rice seeds are edible, as everybody knows, or something more complicated, like very specific chemistry or just ornamental flowers. And they should be reliable quantities, which means that very small amount of stuff, it's not very interesting. So we don't need to cultivate plants which are just very slightly sweet. For example, lots of grass stems are sweet. Children frequently try to chew grass stems because they are sweet. But we only cultivate for the purpose of taking sugar. We cultivate the sugar cane, just one of them. So this is again important criteria. What are other prerequisites for domestication? Again, something useful in reliable quantities. The next extremely important prerequisite is that plant must be cultivable. Of course, to start cultivation process, we need some need to take it to us. So if plant, for example, produces that useful stuff in a way that it's still satisfiable to collect things in the wild nature, we don't need to proceed for cultivation. So in many cases, people still gather plants and mushrooms in the forests and are quite satisfied with this way. The term cultivable means very many things. For example, plant must be possible to grow out of the normal environment. This is really important. Sometimes plants is almost impossible to grow. I know a very good example. Like there is a plant called Aragoa, very strange, interesting plant of Parama, of Colombia and Venezuela. This plant is extremely attractive. Well, I found it because it belongs to my group of interest. I work with plantains, Plantaga, and Aragoa is a sister group to Plantaga. Very strange sister group, I would say. It looks like some conifer with bright white flowers of 4 petals. Wonderful plant, attractive. And of course, people in Bogota, Colombia, wanted to cultivate it slightly lower in a botanical garden in Bogota, but failed. So that plant is almost impossible to move out of Parama, even to the slightly lower altitude of Bogota, which is about 2,000, 3,000 meters above the sea level. Not speaking about cultivation of this plant in a lower environment or in greenhouses. That so far it is impossible. Plant ornamental, probably nice to look on, but it's hard to find a way to cultivate it. And there are reverse examples. For example, there are weeds, plants which are grow everywhere, especially they like to grow nearby humans. So wheats are cultivable to the extreme. And yes, there are multiple cultivated plants which originated from wheats. The best example is probably rye. So rye is a plant which was originated as a wheat. People take it and cultivate by its own because rye has a very short life cycle and also grow quite well in a colder environments. All right, so that's the first one. Plant should be takeable from the natural environment to us. Second one, and third one, and fourth one, and many others also required. So for example, plant should be resistant to diseases which will inevitably arise in when many plants are cultivated together. Plant should have, well, at least more or less affordable agriculture. So you should not exceed your own to cultivate the plant. It should be possible to make it. And rice is a good example because rice have extremely complicated way of cultivation. So I'm sitting on a wall of the field, which is to prevent water to come out of the field because rice start its life cycle in the water and other seedlings manually planted into the water, and then depending on way of cultivation water will be kept here or removed. But rice is a plant of water environments, like semi-aquatic plant, and it needs that way of cultivation. This way of cultivation of rice is modifying everything in Asia. So it says that it even modified the way of social relation between humans. So lots of consequences of rice cultivation. It is worth of it because we need always to consider it. It is worth of it because the total yield of rice is enormous. So with these numbers, we can try to make very complicated ways of cultivation. And number 4, number 5, number 6, many different other requirements which makes plants cultivable. Well, one of the last but not the least is, for example, quite a new idea but very important one, that we should prevent the gene flow between cultivated plants and the wild relatives. This is especially important when we cultivate the plant nearby the wild relatives. So gene flow from the wild plants, especially like if plant is wind pollinated. In that case, genes of the wild plants will intermix with the genes of cultivated plants and will simply erase all our efforts to select or somehow modify the plant genetically. In the reverse, genetically modified, selected plants can put their genes into the wild nature and therefore will damage the natural environment. So this is important. And many other considerations exist in that simple word cultivable. And the third prerequisite, very big one, unfortunately start to be clear only on the long run. This is selectability, I would call it. So plant should be selectable or otherwise anyhow modifiable. So for example, through hybridization or with a, as it now start to be more or less common, direct modification of the genome. So if this is possible, if it is easy enough, then yes, that is a good perspective for that plant. Beautiful example is a sugar beet. So sugar beet is a plant which is selectable to the very high extreme, I would say, because it ancestral varieties didn't contain lots of sugar. But after just 200 years, because the cultivation of sugar beet started around like Napoleon Wars, so like 200 years only, we already selected varieties of sugar beet which are very highly rich of sucrose, and now they compete very well with the sugar cane. And in temperate and warm regions, tropical not, but in temperate and warm temperate subtropical regions, sugar beet is now pushing sugar cane away. it starts to be much cheaper, much more effective to cultivate. Of course, there are multiple sideway consequences. For example, selection of sugar beet for the sucrose means it starts to be vulnerable to multiple diseases, but it's a different story. So when these three most important prerequisites, again, plant should produce something useful in reliable quantities, plant should be cultivable, and plant should be selectable, modifiable. If these prerequisites are met, we start the process of domestication. Domestication very frequently starts from some genetic modification of the plant. So it might be, for example, hybridization or polyploidization or both. So many cultivated plants are hybrids or polyploid. And all cultivated plants are results of intensive selection. So polyploidization, hybridization, and selections are three important markers of the domestication process of Naran. So again, to summarize, most important for the society, the value of cultivated plants, they provide us energy and lots of other things, but energy is of course number one. Then for domestication, we must have plant with something useful in reliable quantities. That plant should be cultivable, so it should be possible with more or less reliable efforts. So rice is an extreme case, but many plants require less efforts. These efforts are important, so that plant should be taken from the natural environment and start to be cultivated. By the way, rice was domesticated multiple times. There was a recent publication about attempts of rice domestication in South America. And finally, the plant must be selectable or otherwise genetically modifiable. Then it will suit us more and more. So this is about cultivated plants and their domestication. Thank you very much for the attention.